So I've got a very short talk for you tonight, just quickly to talk about Elastic Beanstalk generally, but also some of the specifics of running Docker containers on Elastic Beanstalk. No demo, but I've got some code samples to show you. And if you want a demo, I'm going to give you a link to a GitHub repo at the end of this talk. You can pull down a release from that repo, and you can run your own packaged Docker container directly on Elastic Beanstalk for just a few dollars. So rather than a demo, I'm just going to say do the demo yourself. Okay, hey, hi. So my name's Ian, I'm an evangelist with AWS. If you've got any questions that come out of this talk that you don't feel I've answered adequately, you can tweet me, but better, you might send me a mail and I'll either come back to you myself or get another member of the team here in the UK to do that. So just 3 questions before we start. Who's heard of Elastic Beanstalk in here? Wow, pretty good. Who uses Elastic Beanstalk in here? Okay. Who uses Docker on Elastic Beanstalk? Okay, you can help with the questions. Awesome, good stuff. So it's a good talk for you guys. It should introduce you to something new that you maybe haven't heard of or heard about before. So a quick EB, Elastic Beanstalk introduction for those of you that said no to that first question. 2-minute intro. So Elastic Beanstalk, it's a deployment and management tool that allows you to really instantiate, marshal, and control a collection of AWS primitives, okay? So when I say AWS primitives, I'm talking about other AWS services. So it doesn't exist in isolation. It basically creates, updates, and destroys other AWS primitives in order to create a deployment environment for your app. And they might be Elastic Load Balancers, they might be EC2 instance running a variety of different application containers or runtimes. There's also other things that it does, connecting APIs for logging your application so that you can review what's happening inside the containerized environment, connecting your application environment to alarms so that you can trigger alerts on utilization or drive scaling actions. So it orchestrates this collection of AWS resources. And I guess the most important characteristic of Elastic Beanstalk is that it doesn't create a black box. Once you've created those resources, you can go in manually outside of Elastic Beanstalk and you can tweak or change or update the configuration of those resources independently of the tool. Okay, so it will create this environment, but you can then enter that environment with other AWS tools or third-party tools, and you can tweak that environment and do work on it independently of the deployment tool. So it's quite flexible from that perspective. We're supporting 6 runtimes prior to April this year, so Java Tomcat, PHP, .NET on Windows, Python, Node, and Ruby. And on the 23rd of April, we announced Docker support. And really, deployment without Docker was a bit like this, okay? So you get your app, and you put your app into Elastic Beanstalk, and Beanstalk handles the deployment activities that I just talked about. The challenge, of course, is your app might not meet the standard interface definitions that are defined within Beanstalk. So everything looks pretty standard on this one, except it uses a non-compliant version of Python and a different entry point for the app. Okay, so yeah, not quite fitting. You've basically got 2 ways to fix that. Okay, you can fix it over here by reading the EB documentation and modifying the config of your app, maybe changing your runtime or tweaking your entry point. It's pretty disruptive and can take quite a while. Or you can fix it on the other side by applying a set of custom definitions to Elastic Beanstalk that might replace a runtime or change an entry point or provision other services that you need to run that application. Either way is not exactly elegant, let's say. So we came with Docker support, and what we've done with Docker really is obviously provide a standardized deployment container so you can wrap all of those custom components of your application inside that container and slot it into Docker with much less configuration work required on either side. And there's basically 3 options that you have for deploying Docker-based containers onto Elastic Beanstalk. The first is you can just upload a Docker file, and Elastic Beanstalk will build that Docker file on all of the instances in your environment. It's not a particularly dynamic way to do things because your Docker file has to encapsulate everything you have. You can define a manifest called Dockerrun.aws.json, and this will give Elastic Beanstalk a little bit more information about how the environment should be built out. And we'll show you a couple of examples of that in a second and what you can do with that. Or thirdly, probably most powerfully, you can integrate your Docker file and Dockerrun files together with extra application context. So this could be real application assets packaged up in a zip file together with those definition files, run through the Elastic Beanstalk environment, and that will create out your EC2 instances with the Docker container on them, deploy the Docker file in the way that your Dockerrun file describes, and also deploy and position other application assets within your containers. Okay, so that's the most powerful and configurable way of doing this. A couple of examples, hope you can see this. So this is a very simple Dockerrun.aws.json example, which is pulling down a container from the public repo. In this case, it's a public packaged version of the Tomcat application server, and it's connecting a container port to an external interface, an external port on a load balancer. So essentially creating a single or multiple EC2 instances with Tomcat on them and wiring those up in a way which will make them accessible. Now, it's a really bad example because this particular public image needs an environment variable in order to function, or you can't access it. And you can package up those environment variables in your EB extensions directory, creating config files. And this is how you would pass environment variables into your Docker environment, allowing you to perform runtime configuration within the containers. Okay, so that's a model for deploying publicly accessible Docker images, but having the ability to set and configure environment variables within your containers. The zip with app context is a little bit more interesting. So here you would put in your Docker file and your Dockerrun file inside that zip file. And you can see an example up top right here of positioning other assets. So if you put a file called index.html inside your zip, this particular bit of Docker file config would grab a copy of the Nginx image that you can see there, and it would move that asset out of your zip file to that predetermined path within your virtual container. Okay, and you can use this for very powerful deployment workflows with lots of richness. And then again, you can see an example of Dockerrun, which does this wiring up of certain ports on the containers into the ELB. Okay, so that's a quick example. Much more complicated, complete example maybe. Go here, and you can find the source for this. This is quite an interesting example because it shows a very, very comprehensive example of an app that uses other AWS services. And this is a really important aspect of Elastic Beanstalk that we didn't really touch on yet. But EB allows you to create and integrate with other AWS services beyond the basic services that are included in the container. Okay? And it will handle things like credentials, access credentials for those other services that you might want to access. So it's a little bit wordy, in fact not visible on this screen. But if you take a look at the sample, you can see that you can use Elastic Beanstalk together with Docker to integrate your app with other AWS services. This particular example is integrating with a non-relational data source, DynamoDB. It's integrating with a notification service called SNS, and it's also integrating with a queuing service. You define all these services that you want to use within a YAML file, which sits within your zip file that you're creating in that EB extensions directory. And by doing that, you can cleanly create large collections of AWS services, wire them into your application with credentials that will permit access only from your application instances, and then maybe most importantly, clean them all up when your application's lifetime's finished or you want to do a new deploy. So you'll avoid having any services in your account which are orphaned, which have been used. You've torn down an application environment, but you've forgotten to clean up some of the resources. You can completely avoid that by using this kind of deployment tool and deal with these questions of ensuring the right level of privileged access to other services within your account. Okay, and this is something that we see not only in server-based applications of the type that you might run with Docker, but also increasingly with mobile apps, where people are developing and running mobile apps on AWS without having compute instances. They're directly accessing cloud-based services from within the app, and they're using reduced privileges granted by some of the authentication services that we've got to help them do that in a very, very secure and trustworthy way. Okay, so you can extend that into these kind of platform tools with this sort of construct. Okay, if you want to learn more, you can go here, AWS, Amazon.com, Elastic Beanstalk. You all had that as homework, actually, before you came to the session. So I saw David send that out, so maybe you've done that already. And I don't have credits, but I do have this. So I'd like to invite you all to a free one-day event, which is taking place on the 30th next week. We're going to be in a venue a little bit slightly larger than this at Euston Square, next door to Euston Station. We're going to have a one-day event focusing on implementing DevOps practices using AWS tools and services. We'll have customer speakers can release this here. Justy and ITV will be on stage talking about their implementations with us. We'll also have a solutions architect drop in there. So if you've got any difficult questions about AWS services, come along to this event. You'll find some of our solutions architects there that have worked with customers across the UK, several of whom I can see in the room here today. And you can get more information about how you can use AWS services in this kind of environment at that event. I'd love to see you all there. Sign up here. And that's all I have for you. Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you.